So today's session really is about looking in depth on the 2025 SADC SRHR Scorecard that was completed last year, and it was reported by our countries, which really showed us our data with regards to where we are in terms of our SRHR commitments in the region. And I think one of the biggest things that really showed us was that as a region, we are at a crossroads in terms of meeting some of those targets that we are meant to, and especially for specific indicators. And we also realized that some of our indicators we are really achieving, and we are in progress towards achieving our 2030 targets, but obviously, so it can never be the case for everything. So for some indicators, including family planning and STIs, whereby we are seeing a regression in terms of the achievements that we had already gained in the past couple of years. But however, for today's session, really, we want to just go in depth and try to look beyond what the numbers are saying in terms of exploring what these trends mean in practice, and why are some of these indicators are regressing, and why probably we are really performing very well in some of those indicators. And for those ones that are worsening or stagnating, we really want to just delve deeper in terms of what else can we do in terms of closing those gaps, and as we are moving towards 2030, and we are all aware that we are almost less than 4 years towards the 2030 targets. So with that, colleagues, I will really want to hand over to our main speaker for today, Richard Delayed, who is our program manager for the Together for SRHR program in the region and based at UNFPA. So I would allow Richard to actually introduce himself and then also share his insights with us today. And over to you, Richard. And just to appreciate you one more, that we are happy that you took your time this morning to actually share what the 2025 scorecard is actually telling us. Over to you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anele, and good morning, colleagues, and welcome to this morning's conversation. And I hope it will be a conversation. I will try and rattle through the slides as quickly as what I can, so that we have a lot more time for dialogue and discussion, because I think the real value in these numbers really lie in the conversations that we have around these numbers. So if we can move to the next slide. So first of all, what is a scorecard? So first of all, this scorecard is a peer-reviewed tool. So it's used by countries to have a snapshot of progress on the SADC SRHR strategy and the SRHR targets of the SDGs. So just for context, SADC in 2018 developed an SRHR strategy. In that strategy, they agreed on 20 outcome indicators that they want to measure to see whether the region is on track or off track in meeting the aims and objectives of its strategies. A lot of those targets are then linked to the SDG targets as well, specifically around SDG 3 and SDG 5, SDG 3 being on good health and well-being, and SDG 5 on ending gender inequality. So the scorecard, all of this was conceived in 2018 and was really driven by the governments of Eswatini, South Africa, and one other country, which I'm Namibia. And so developed in 2019, the baseline scorecard was done, and it's a milestone scorecard. And I'll explain that in a minute, because what it does is every 2 years, countries have milestones which measure the extent to which they are achieving those targets that they set based on their baselines. Now, the important thing to remember here, the SDG targets is a universal target for all countries, right? But not all countries will necessarily reach the SDGs. What we try to do is to make sure that we work with countries to get as close as possible to the SDG targets, or to ensure that countries are able to reach that target as quickly as possible. So we want to see progress. We want to see how things are moving towards those strategy outcome indicators and towards the targets. It is then also a social accountability tool. So it uses a traffic light system to track the 20 indicators for the 16 member states of the SADC region. So this was formally adopted by the SADC Ministers of Health in 2018, and like I said, baseline scorecard done in 2019. Next slide, please. So the methodology that we used for this year's scorecard was really to understand what has been the progress from baseline. So we're really looking at what the numbers were in 2018 versus what the numbers were in 2025. And then we tried to see who made progress and who didn't make progress. As I said, it uses a traffic light indicator. So for ease of reference, if you look at the key over here, you will see a deep green means that the SDG target has been met. A lighter green means that the milestone has been met, which means those countries are on track. The orange means that they're off track by about 1 to 15%. And then you can see right down here, if it's red, it means they're off track by about 30%. And I'll go more in detail. So this slide really looks at maternal mortality. And what we can see in maternal mortality is that 6 countries recorded significant reductions in maternal mortality. And this is based on national health data that countries reported themselves. What is very interesting about maternal mortality and what is very pleasing to see about this progress is that ministers of health in the SADC region actually declared maternal mortality a priority. I think it was around about 2020. And what we have seen is phenomenal progress across a number of countries. In several countries, and again, this relies on DHS data, so that data is updated as we get new DHS data. But in many of the countries where we saw new DHS data come in, what we saw was that up to 50% declines in maternal mortality in countries like Lesotho and in Malawi. So that clearly indicates how having that political commitment behind an indicator really translates into action, and it shows the commitment of the countries in moving this indicator forward. Next slide. Another area where we have seen good progress, and this is really pleasing to see, is in the rate of mother-to-child transmission. 12 member states are on track to meet the SDG target by 2030, and 5 of them, 5 of whom have already achieved this target in 2025. So if you look at the dark green here, we see 31.3% of the countries have met this target, and if we look at the light green, 43.8%. So there's good progress made across more, I would say, about 60% of the countries. 70% of the countries, we're actually seeing really good progress in the reductions of mother-to-child transmission. We also are seeing that there's a reduction in new HIV infections amongst adolescent girls and young women. And this is also partly linked to increases in comprehensive sexuality education. So across the region, we see most countries reporting up to 90% coverage in comprehensive sexuality education in primary school. However, what we must point out is even though we've seen this great progress in reducing new HIV infections, what this scorecard showed us was that new infections is actually declining slightly. And those declines, if we look at the numbers again, we can see condom usage has gone down. We can see STIs have increased. We know that STIs is one of the contributing factors towards new HIV infections. So again, we can see the interplay between factors that cause infections and new infections, and of course, with developments in the global aid arena in the last year or so, this is an indicator we need to watch quite carefully, because we know that prevention has been severely impacted by declines in overseas development assistance. So this is one indicator that we will need to track very closely as we move forward to see whether that disruption is actually going to lead to new infections and actually roll back the gains made in the region. Next slide. So I think one of the areas that we're really seeing the need for urgent attention and where we seem to be regressing is around the unmet need for family planning. And as you can see, compared to baseline, we've got 50% of countries are now off target in terms of addressing the unmet need for family planning. And we need to understand the interplay between access to family planning and issues like teen pregnancy. And we have seen across the region a high increase in teen pregnancy. Even though the adolescent fertility rate is declining, we're still seeing a large numbers of teen pregnancies. And that is partly attributed to the unmet need for family planning, because we do know from other data sources that the unmet need is highest amongst adolescent girls and young women who are not in relationships. In other words, they're not married, they're not in cohabitating relationships. We see a very high level of new infections occurring there. And that then also is coupled with teen pregnancies. All of these things are interlinked, right? So if we're seeing a teen pregnancy, we're likely to see also HIV infections coming in, and potentially also maternal mortality, because we know that teens are at greater risk of maternal death owing to complications during birth. So the bottom line around this is that if we really want to ensure the economic development of our countries, we really need to invest in increasing access to family planning, because this enables young girls and young women to actually achieve their full potential. Beyond the numbers, we also need to address the laws and the policy barriers that impede access to contraceptives for adolescent girls and young women. Because again, those are some of the barriers that exist, and we know that in many countries there are very high age restrictions on access to family planning without third-party consent. Next slide. Intimate partner violence and gender-based violence in general across the region remains a very big factor in Southern Africa, and especially in the SADC region. In several of the countries, we see intimate partner violence exceeding 30%. And so it is an area that we need to address. We have seen quite a rapid rollout by countries of relevant laws and policies. We also know that SADC Parliamentary Forum has developed a model law around gender-based violence in the region, in which against which countries are benchmarking their national laws and policies. So we're seeing the laws and policies being developed. But laws and policies are only one part of the equation. We now have to implement those laws and policy. We need to ensure that those policies and laws are implemented to the fullest extent possible. We also need to look at programs that are addressing male norms and attitudes. So to what extent are we engaging men and boys in the response? Because men and boys have often been left out of the response. So we do have a couple of countries that are doing some really innovative and interesting work around male engagement. And I think those are some case studies that we can look at in the future. But addressing gender-based violence means we have to address both sides of the equation. We have to, one, ensure that survivors are well cared for, that they receive care, appropriate care, that they also receive appropriate care to prevent new HIV infections and unintended pregnancies. But at the other side of the equation, we also have to work with men and boys to look at gender and social norms, and to also look at men and boys' sexual and reproductive health and rights as well. Next slide, please. So why does the scorecard matter? And I think it matters for a number of reasons. First of all, it is a key tool to monitor progress in advancing SRHR. But most importantly, it's a key tool for us to understand how are we meeting the needs of our people. Behind every single number, there's a person. And if we think about that person and we put that person at the center of what we're supposed to be doing, then it shows us the power of using the scorecard to meet the needs of that person and people who are being left behind. It is also an accountability mechanism for governments to uphold those commitments. So this scorecard is shared with the SADC Ministers of Health every 2 years. They review the scorecard. They actually look at areas of progress and areas lagging behind. They debate the scorecard, and then they also talk through what they as a country can do. And I must be honest, since we've introduced the scorecard, we've seen vast improvements by countries in reporting on certain key indicators. We've seen vast improvements also in terms of reporting on the numbers, but also going beyond the numbers. So countries do submit a report in which they try and explain why some of the numbers are the way they are. So It's really a good accountability mechanism and an ability for governments to take stock, regroup, and think about where to focus for the next 2 years. So as I've already spoken about government, and I think for governments also the benefit of the scorecard is it helps with prioritization. But I have to be honest with you, we cannot afford to not sustain the progress in areas in which we've made progress. So it's a bit of a juggling act. You want to sustain progress where you've made progress, but then you also have to accelerate in the areas where you have not made progress. So that's the key thing for governments is looking at from a prioritization point of view, understanding where they're at, and then looking as to whether their current strategies are working, whether they're not working, and whether there's something else they need to do. For donors, it's really a return on investment scorecard, right? It's really saying to you, okay, how are we doing in terms of the returns on what we're investing in SRHR. And for donors, again, it's again an opportunity for donors to think through, okay, where do we need to invest to accelerate? Where do we need to invest to sustain? So for donors, it's also a good tool to use and to analyze and to understand what is going on in the region. For advocates and those working in SRHR, especially civil society, I think key here is to really advocate around the gaps and really also to ensure that we do not lose ground. So advocates and civil society organizations have that responsibility. And I would even encourage advocates and civil society to even take the scorecard and look at going beyond the numbers. Go into communities, find out what is going on. We have seen some great innovations around community-based scorecards. So I think if we can have a look at that, that would be great. And then also the general public can use the scorecard for information purposes. So very quickly, Zanella, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing and I'm going to share my screen and quickly flash to the scorecard. And this will be very quick because I hope we have time for discussions. So I'm just going to use the indicator on maternal mortality. Oh, have I shared? No, I don't think I've shared. Hold on. Let me go back here. Share. So going back into the scorecard, and I think you can all see it, I'm going to use maternal mortality, and for case of demonstration, I'm going to use Botswana. So if we click on Botswana, we can see this is the maternal mortality ratio indicator per 100,000 deliveries. And we can see what it was in Botswana at baseline. So at baseline, it was 143 per 100,000 deliveries. And then when we come to 2021, we can see that Botswana has basically regressed. They started on 143, and in 2021, it slid back to 166, while the milestone was supposed to be 131. And then there was a further regression in 2023, where maternal mortality slid back to 243. But interestingly, Botswana seems to be recovering, and in the 2025 data, it's now improved to 176.7. The main thing to keep in mind here is that if we look at, and I'm scared to move my dial, so okay, if we look at the 2021, 2023 data, we have to factor in that the COVID response. And we know that at the beginning of COVID, there was a huge disruption towards maternal mortality data. So when we look at this data, we have to look at the trends in light of things that have happened in the country. We also know that during this period, there were droughts, there were floods. So for Botswana, but very encouragingly for in Botswana, we're seeing this recovery. So we're seeing maternal mortality come down to 176.7. So for Botswana, the key issue now would be, okay, what can we do in the next 2 years to really get back on track, to get back to the 2027 milestone, which is supposed to be 94. If Botswana can get it down to 94 or close there too, they would be able to come close to meeting the SDG targets. So for Botswana, that's the key thing. And I think Botswana was and still remains, I think, one of the countries we think can get there. We've got 4 more years left, but if it will take a concerted effort, but if we put in that effort, we should be able to reach the target. And again, this is not about reaching the target. This is about really making sure that we reduce any and eliminate any preventable maternal mortality. So with that, I'm going to stop, Zanele, and I'll open it up for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you for that comprehensive overview of what the scorecard is telling us. And I think most of us who are on the call, we get to understand where we are in terms of SRHR, HIV, and GBV in the region. So with these few minutes that are left, I would invite our colleagues, if you've got any comments, any questions that we have. And I just noting on the chat as well, there is no question that I'm seeing, but if there is any, please do raise your hand and open your mic and go ahead. So we have Marietta, please go ahead and please keep it short so that you can get the response as well. Over to you, Marietta. Marietta, we can't hear you. You can go ahead and speak. You're unable to unmute. All right, IT colleagues, please unmute Marietta.
Fantastic. Hi,
Awesome.
and good morning. This is Marietta. Thank you for your presentation, Richard. So you're probably aware of a meeting that we recently had in Mozambique with representatives of SADC, IGAD, and the International Conference for the Great Lakes region. So one of the SADC colleagues there mentioned this scorecard quite a few times. And he specifically mentioned it as a potential tool for tracking SRHR with focus on GBV in humanitarian settings. I mean, we're all aware of this massive data gaps that we have on these matters in humanitarian settings, but I was a bit surprised because I thought the scorecard would probably be better for more like medium-term progress tracking, like, you know, with a 2-year rhythm that you just presented on. Would you say that you think this could be turned into a more like short-term tracking tool? Do you think it would be able to accommodate that kind of flexibility? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Go over to you, Richard.
That's a great question, and thank you, Marietta. So I think the challenge that we have with the outcome indicators is, like I said, a lot of those indicators rely on population-based data. I know that SADC this year, February, Ministers of Health approved the new monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning plan for SADC linked to the scorecard, which is more intermediate indicators. And it would be possible for us to track some of those more intermediate indicators on a more regular basis. So together with the European Union and with funding from the European Union and together with the government of Sweden, we actually are embarking on a new sort of program to try and strengthen SRHR indicators, including in humanitarian settings. I think what we can agree upon is that I think our HIV data is pretty strong across the region. But the other dimensions of SRHR tend to lag behind. And then we're also looking at how we can standardize the indicators across the region so that we can have tracking of core indicators. So I think the next iteration of the scorecard post 2030 will hopefully have more intermediate variables in addition to the outcome variables, but we also have to be careful that we don't increase the reporting burden on countries. So it's a fine balance between those two. I hope I've answered your question, Marietta.
Right, thank you, Richard. I think you have answered, Marietta, and if there is any additional info or follow-up from Marietta, I think we can engage bilaterally, but otherwise, the scorecard, it's clear, it presents us an opportunity to also track other indicators. And then in terms of the frequency, obviously that can be discussed and also agreed on. So colleagues, with that, I'm not seeing any other question or comment. in the chat box. So thank you so much, Richard, for sharing your insights. And I think walking away today, we know where we are and we know where we are going, and we know which areas that we need to work on going forward in order for us to close the gaps. And I think one thing for me that stood out was that we still need to focus really more on ensuring the adolescent girls and young women are covered in terms of unmet family planning contraceptives, and also ensuring that our people have access to HIV prevention packages, and also the STIs that are now really emerging. And I think that also presents us an opportunity to work towards, our SDG targets. So with that, colleagues, I think I would want to just remind you that the session was recorded and we are going to share it.
Sorry,
And
Sanela, can I just respond to Marietta? She's just put a follow-up
a follow-up.
comment
Okay,
in.
one more minute. Sure.
So I think, Marietta, to your point, I think the question is, how do we use Raise SRHR really as an opportunity to strengthen the scorecard? So I really think that, and especially the data around emergencies. So I really hope that as we finalize, as we look at Raise SRHR, let's use that as an opportunity to also look at SRHR data in emergencies. And then Jessica, maybe somebody can drop the link to the, I can try and drop the link to the scorecard in the chat for those who want to who'd like to get access to it. And I believe this recording will also be on the Together for SRHR Knowledge Hub.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Richard. And I would also just want to appreciate everyone for taking their time today, and also just to our main speaker, Richard, for sharing those beautiful insights on the 2025 SADC SRHR Scorecard. And thank you, everyone, and you will have a good day and a good week.